we wanted to get a little information from you. So if you can break up a second screen or a secondary device that allows you to, so you can see a second screen, and go to menti.com, www.menti.com. You can use that direct link, or I can also type in the chat box. And there is a code, a numerical code that it's going to ask for. And that numerical code is 7527 7759. And I'm going to type that in as well. So you go to menti.com, type in that code, you can click the direct link. And we're just trying to gauge, get a little data based on the users here. And the question is, how familiar are you with load, ICA data, and or maps? And we would love to get your response from that. We know we have 91 or 90 participants today. So as people are coming in or they're coming back from lunch, we just want to gather this data. When I get about 10 to 12 answers, I'll take the ball from you, Taro, or you can send it to me.
Hey, Robert, I don't see the link in the chat.
Robert, I think you sent it privately to me. Can you please send it to everyone?
I put it to all attendees.
So if you do everyone, then the panelists can see it too, and we have almost 30 panelists.
Yeah, I don't see that. All panelists. There's another one I see. Okay.
Maybe I could do that.
I got it. I got all panelists now.
Yes.
And I'll put all that information in there as well.
Okay, everyone should have it.
I'll give them they're probably looking for the code. And once again, data is a good thing. And the question is, how familiar are you personally with load, ICA data, and maps? I'm going to share my screen here. You're going to start seeing the results coming in, the tool that we use in our trainings, quite often just to gather some information. 3 familiar right now, 11 somewhat familiar, 6 very familiar, which is one of those, the top choice there, and then 5 not really familiar. So looks like you still have some people coming back from lunch or people trying to figure things out. As we have 25 out of 90 responses. Once again, you just need a secondary mode of reaching the internet. You're going to go to menti.com, or you can use the direct link that's in the chat, and just let us know, how familiar are you with load, ICA data, and maps? And Taru, we can either put a time limit on this or a response limit. Looks like we've got 30 now, right? Some people may be slow coming back for lunch. That's why it's always good to do this right after lunch, so you can see what your audience is before you go into more of those important conversations.
So Robert, I was thinking of giving it maybe 3 more minutes. Hopefully we'll get some more responses.
Okay. Thank you for those that have responded. We definitely appreciate the feedback. And it kind of helps gear our conversations, knowing how familiar people are with the subject matter experts, subject matter that we might be bringing up. We're a little over a third now, and still seems like a fourth of that, 25% of it, is very familiar. A little over a third, somewhat familiar. You got 25% that is not really familiar. And then about 1/9, which is, yeah, I've heard of it. Right. Looks like that's all we're going to get out of this one. I'll leave it open for a while if you want to continue your discussion, or are we going to go right into the second question?
So that, Robert, the second question will be asked at the end of the panel at around
Okay.
2:30. Yeah.
Around 2:30. Okay.
Yeah, can we leave this question open? Do we still
I
have
will.
time? Thank
Yep,
you.
I'll let you continue your presentation. All the information has been sent to everybody, and I'll leave it open for another 5 minutes.
So, Robert, do you still need to be in presenter mode, or can I pass the ball to someone else?
No, you can pass the ball to someone else. As the results are coming in, before I do the first question, or at some point I'll be happy to share the results with everybody. But nope, you can pass the ball.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can. So I'd like to introduce our panelists while people on the side are also sending in their responses. We were initially scheduled to have 5 panelists, but unfortunately, one of the panelists had an emergency, so we have 4 great panelists today. And these are the bios that went out to the service list, but I'd like to read them here today. So the first panelist is Ferdinand Chanko, who is the Director of Grid Integration for EVgo, where he manages a team of utility project engineers who support utility integration nationwide to drive the process of electrification of EVgo chargers. He has an educational background in electrical engineer with an emphasis on power systems, and has spent several years working for a large utility provider in many different capacities. His current role with EVgo supports the framework to drive forward new utility EV business practices, innovation in tools, and acceleration in EV electrification. Can we have the next one, Tyler? Okay, so the next panelist we have is Kevin Cushman, who is a startup veteran and has a very long career in energy technology and infrastructure. Since 2020, Kevin has served as the founding CEO of Electrada, which is an electric vehicle infrastructure company across North America. Prior to this role, Kevin's 25+ years in the energy tech, software, and analytics sectors include CEO and CFO roles with Integral Analytics, Blue Pillar, and Current Group, and founding leadership of Synergy Ventures Corporate Venture Fund. And these enterprises have played instrumental roles in the transition of the electric grid and clean transportation. Kevin is a graduate of Miami University with a bachelor's in economics and has received an MBA from Xavier University. So our third panelist is Matthew Rylander, who is the technical lead engineer at EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute. He currently manages the Advanced Analytics project set within the Distribution Operations and Planning Program. His current research activities include grid modeling, utilization of measurement data, and wide area distribution assessment to support strategic planning. Dr. Rylander has pioneered research surrounding hosted capacity analysis and has implemented those analytics within the tool EPRI Drive TM, used by many utilities worldwide, 35 utilities. And before joining EPRI, Matthew received his doctorate from UT Austin in 2008 and worked at the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. So the panelist that is unfortunately not able to join is Noel Crisostomo from the Department of Energy. And our last panelist is Taylor Honnet, who is Tesla's design lead for Northern California charging infrastructure. He oversees Tesla's project coordination for EV charging projects that include Tesla's ecosystem of products to support EVs. This includes DC fast charging, AC charging, PV, and BESS. Taylor's team supports utility coordination on individual projects and long-term strategic discussions about capacity and grid planning. So can we pause here and get results of the survey, Robert?
We can. It really hasn't changed. It's still the same 33 answers, but I'd be happy to share it with you.
I think if it's the same, then we can probably just move ahead. So I think we kind of have a sense of who the audience is at this point. Okay,
Sounds
thank you
good.
very much. So in this segment, we're going to start a 2-hour panel discussion. And there are 6 questions for the panelists. The panelists will answer each question in turn. And there may be a chance for a second round where a panelist may choose to respond to something that another panelist has said. However, in this segment, we do not have time for Q&A, but we will have time afterwards, after a break, for Q&A to the panelists, if they're able to stay, to the IOUs, or even to Energy Division. So I'd like to start with the first question. And the question is, how do you currently utilize the load ICA data? How would you like to use the load ICA data in the future?
Hey, Tara, I believe I'm first. So this is for Nanchenko for responding to question 1 here. So EVgo currently leverages the ICA to the best of our ability at a high level to project our interconnection process opportunities based on existing structures and feeder load data availability. EVgo's key targets are to reduce CapEx and find opportunities to streamline our build process at an early state. In the future, we would like there to be some increased accuracy in the load ICA data to provide a better approach on our network planning. This would include, but are not limited to, the following: known grid constrained distribution areas, increased detail in deployed distribution assets, and details regarding any underutilized assets for low-hanging fruit opportunities.
Thank you.
I came off mute, but Tori, did you have an order by which you wanted to go through the panelists to answer the question, or is it kind of free for all?
I think we're just going through alphabetically.
Okay.
So I think, Kevin, you're next.
That's great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Teru. Electrata is, although a relatively new company, 3 years old at this point. We're a build, own, operate, maintain enterprise. So we focus primarily on fleets and fleet electrification nationally, and have spent, like everyone else, doing fleets starting in California significantly. But what we do is purposefully build depot electrification systems that we own and operate as the metered electric customer of the utility on behalf of our fleet customers. So if you think about an enterprise that might operate somewhere between 3 and 5, all the way up to 20 to 30 individual fleet electrification depots within a specific utility service territory, for us, utilizing load ICA data is really important because we will have very granular information about the charging load profiles at each individual site. And we'll look to help that entity that we're serving, the customer, fleet owner, to help prioritize the deployment methodology and priority across their individual fleet portfolio. So we'll help rank order sites that might be first in line as far as available capacity, how that capacity would interact with the grid as it currently stands. And then, of course, looking forward, since our investments with our fleet customers are up to 10 years long that we manage for them, understanding what the growth profile on load at the feeder level will be to determine if there will be any constraints 2, 3, 4 years out into the life cycle of the owned assets. So it's both important from a planning perspective, but certainly from a growth perspective, because as many of you know, fleets are adding vehicles in a sequential nature, in an incremental nature at any one individual depot. So it might be 10, 20% at a time. So that future look is really important, and the modeling we do at the site is incredibly important.
Thank you. Matt, you're next.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Taru. It's a pleasure to be here on the panel today and happy to talk about these 6 great questions you have. Load ICA is really a powerful type of tool. You know, it's really given and will give a better view onto how much you can accommodate with new load. The time varying aspect of hosting capacity in ICA is going to be a really powerful instrument as well moving into the future. Just like Kevin just mentioned, profiles of how much you can accommodate become really important. Where we are right now today, in my perspective, is load ICA is really geared towards interconnection and screening primarily, really looking at how much and where you can put new fast chargers onto the grid. Somewhere that we need to go in the future, looking forward, is what the utilities actually mentioned quite well in their presentation earlier of looking planning wise. How do we look out into the future, say 2 to 5 years forward, of how much can we accommodate, especially expecting that there's going to be a whole distribution of these new resources coming on. How do we plan the grid for being able to accommodate that future growth, that distributed growth? So in the future, ICA is going to have to look out, and probably will look out more from that planning perspective of how much you can accommodate. Even further looking out, maybe more coincided with that, is looking at dynamic operating envelopes. Hosting capacity in ICA can also be a powerful tool to help determine how much you can accommodate on a near-term perspective as the grid is more regularly changing. So a lot of opportunities there for ICA. The near-term use, looking at screening and interconnection is very powerful, but looking out further into the future, into planning and operating the grid, is going to become very important as well.
Thank you. Taylor, you're next.
Thank you. Specific to Tesla's current use of the ICA map data for EV charging station siting, we currently use it as kind of a prelim check to review existing circuit maps and related to our proposed location and any load data we can get from that. As mentioned a lot, we hope for reliability increase. We've found that we really can't use that data for any resource allocation or business decisions. That all has to go through the formal engineering assessment. Now, moving forward, obviously increased reliability. We'd also like for it to be a source for additional grid information that would include more details like transformer locations and ratings, fault or interrupter locations, and then obviously accurate load availability. As mentioned in some of the stuff previously, this would greatly help both the IOUs and our group to support energization targets by helping focus our resources into sightings our charging stations in spots that don't require, or at least minimize, extensive on and off-site work. It's both time and cost intensive, and that way we can efficiently site our stuff elsewhere if needed in order to support the needs of all of the transportation electrification customers.
So we have a little bit of time on the first question, and instead of the hand raise function, if any of the panelists want to address another panelist's opening comments, please feel free to do so. Okay, can we move on to question number 2 then? Yeah. So the question is, what barriers or challenges have you encountered using the load ICA data? And we'll start with Ferdinand, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty common theme, and it was pretty enlightening listening to the IOUs speak upon accuracy and really just trying to dive into the specifics of how accurate can we get the data to be? Because ultimately, at this point, EVgo is not reliant on the data that is fed, which ultimately, causes us to have an increased flux of submissions to the utility, hence generating a higher attrition and utilizing more resources on the utilities end. Obviously, on our end, we want to try to provide as much accuracy as possible, and reduce attrition on the utilities end, and tool an enhancement of this will ultimately serve to that. But until we're able to somehow leverage it in ways to make key and concise business decisions, I don't think we're going to see much slowdown in the filtration of what we're pushing through to the utility.
Thank you. Kevin, would you like to make some comments on this question?
Sure. I think there'll be a theme developing around reliability and frequency of updates and so forth, and just a recognition that, again, as we operate nationally, California's availability of data relative to other states is obviously well ahead of the game. So I think we're dealing with a 1%er problem to a certain extent. If my fellow panelists recognize that, I think they will. But even in that sense, the temporal nature of what we do as planners across infrastructure builds within California really requires us to have a sense for what those new known projects will look like. And most of those new known projects will ultimately be multi-year implementations or load adds themselves. So trying to get out of this idea of spot loads, and 576 is great. We have 8760 load shapes at our locations because they are truly managed loads as fleet implementations. So we have much better control and understanding of what the shapes look like. So I think just the somewhat static or relatively kind of the red, yellow, green problems that we have as far as using that beyond just indicative is something we'd love to see enhanced. And I know those are part of the things addressed by the utilities.
Thank you. Matt, you're next.
Yeah. My main theme is on grid models and grid model quality, getting better models, and it's a recurring theme too from the utilities, talking about how they're developing better grid models, getting more of those updates and even configuration changes and growth into those models. And that's something that continually needs to evolve and get better and better, because that gets back to Ferdinand's concern of how much you are going to really account for those results of the accuracy. One thing that can help also produce a little bit more security around the results that are being produced, or creating more grid model quality indices of how good are the models that we're starting with, and how good is the data that we're utilizing in some of these studies. I think that's an important theme to think about as well, of knowing how good your underlying data is to then feel more comfortable with what type of results you're looking at within some of these maps, and also in some of the 576 curves that are produced. So having more assurance, being able to really provide that clarity of the grid models are getting better. And as a grid modeler myself, we know that it's something that we're working to get better and better at. Distribution utilities, are actively modeling more to be able to do whatever studies they need to do in the modern grid. So important.
Thank you.
So I'll reiterate a lot of this again. Our biggest challenge is that the ICA data has proven in our experience to be inaccurate as a tool for us. So those results we see are historically unreliable to where we can't effectively utilize it for site selection. We want to be able to use ICA to determine efficient locations that are best for all stakeholders, and that would reduce the time and resources required to energize our stations. We spend a great amount of time and resources on preparing due diligence for sites based on the ICA data, to later find out that it's going to take extensive upgrades and many years to be able to support that load. We then restart the process with another site in hopes to find an area of the grid that can support our customer needs. And again, as mentioned earlier, this adds to the resource constraints of not only ourselves, but the IOUs, as we're wasting these resources in canceling applications in order to keep searching to find locations that can fulfill customer needs.
Thank you. So would any panelist like to address another panelist's remarks to question 2?
I'd just like to call out for the broader group, I think, because we represent a slightly different use cases between public charging, what could be hybrid or workplace, destination type charging, and what we do on the fleet side, which is a much more dedicated, designated type of energy supply for known loads. So I think that the broader group should, and the utilities hopefully will recognize the difference in needs in terms of the ability to have to go back and re-rack applications based on inaccurate guidance from the ICA maps. That's important reconsideration as far as the mandate to get more sites out and lit and energized. For us, it's critical that we have detailed data about a specific site, because we don't have necessarily second, third, fourth order sites that can back them up. So I think it's important for the ICA teams at the utilities to understand who they're interacting with and the type and depth of data being provided for that discussion.
And I'll also kind of comment on that too. You know, the application of the results, there's a lot of different assumptions that need to be played into the analysis for what that end use application. If it was for, say, fleet electrification, that's different type of analysis as compared to, say, distributed residential EV electrification, to how the analysis conducted, you know, looking at ICA site by site or location by location, how much you can accommodate, gives you that fleet view more than that residential distributed growth across a feeder. So that's something to recognize in the ICA data, you know, what's been studied underneath, especially as we start talking about planning in some of these later questions. How the analysis is conducted there is going to be different than how the analysis is currently being conducted right now for the ICA maps.
Thank you. So just pausing to see if there are more comments on question 2, or if we can move on to question 3. So question number 3, how do the IOU's load ICA improvements underway align with and support the goals of EV load siting and energization and building electrification? So can we start with Ferdinand, please?
Yeah, I mean, it all seems to be going in the right direction, but there is still a concern on our end around timeline, right? Because in essence, the time is now in what we're deploying and trying to figure out, you know, what data we can leverage in order for us to, you know, create better decisions on the front end as far as our siting is concerned. I was highly encouraged about some of the specifics that were outlined by Southern California Edison, and just the user-friendly nature that was identified in some of the screenshots. I think will be, you know, leveraged internally within our organization. You know, just so that more so to be used by other entities outside of some of the more technical folks in the early site acquisition process, and identifying opportunity and constraints, right? And really that's, and to speak on it at a very high level on the front end from EVgo side, that's really how we use the ICA tool, is trying to define opportunity versus constraint at the end of the day at an extremely high level. I think with, you know, the vast loading criteria that we have, because we deploy loads anywhere between 1 megawatt upwards to about 9 megawatts for more fleet-based applications. There certainly is usability all across the board for us, and being able to, you know, somehow take the information that's released by the utilities and be able to digest that as a developer is going to be key in the implementation of this in the next 7 years.
So I'd echo Ferdinand's enthusiasm about where the trajectory we're on, and the enhancements that have been published and roadmaps are great. Of course, building in more rapid updates and especially for us, the recognition of future loads being part of the analysis on the baseline basis and recognizing they'll be updated on at least a monthly frequency. So getting a sense of how we essentially snap our new load into that analysis, or at least compare the load shapes as they're being presented through ICA is helpful. And I think the easier user interface is great. I don't want to jump the gun to the next question or two, but thinking about how some of this capability can be pushed into the hands of users who have expertise to be able to run models on their own, without, of course, disconnecting the utility from the interconnection or service request evaluation specifically. But there may be an opportunity to allow some of this capability to be used on a discrete basis going forward. So we'd like to see that being brought into the process. I think it was mentioned once earlier in the previous session.
I like to add that everything that the utilities were talking about earlier, adding in growth of generation and load into the analysis is going to be important, because static type, not, I shouldn't say static, the hosting capacity based off of current conditions is going to be different than if you do know there's going to be certain load growth or generation growth over the next year. So getting that aspect into it is important. So I'm glad to hear that as an improvement underway. I also like the idea of getting some of the planned changes into the analysis too. That way we're not just looking at the feeder as is now, but the feeder as it will be in the near term. One thing though I did kind of catch at that point is, when it was discussed earlier, we have to be careful as well. One thing we don't want to do is say we forecast this much generation growth on the feeder, and then we say, well, we can actually accommodate this much more load or this much more EV, and then that growth doesn't happen, and then your hosting capacity then goes back down. So it's got to be careful. If you're doing this forecast, you're embedding it into the analysis, you don't want to be overestimating what you might be able to accommodate through some of these maps and analyses. So that's important to recognize. The 576, getting some of that time-based hosting capacity variability is really going to be important, especially for fleet EVs. Being able to cite not just how much can you accommodate, but if you have the ability to charge and control that charge, it can be very informative. Whether or not you have the more capability, say, to charge overnight versus during the day or some other non-optimal time, perhaps. Those are important things. One thing that I also like to bring into perspective here too, a lot of this has to really do with building electrification too. When we're talking about building electrification, is buildings that are converting from gas heating to heat pumps, electric heat pumps, and these are loads that are already on the grid. Well, if now we look at how much available hosting capacity where we already know there is load or these customers, how much could we accommodate? It also gives you granularity into perhaps demand flexibility for those types of customers. If those buildings are electrifying, they have the capability now to see, well, there's maybe something that I can play with of there's more ability to, or maybe I can control my load throughout the day and take advantage of that. It also informs time of use rates too. What might be a better or worse time of use rate, or how the utility might want to perhaps incentivize certain types of rates that may be time-based and variable. So those are a couple of comments that I just wanted to throw in there.
Okay, and then from my perspective, yeah, I agree, generally happy with the improvements presented today. Increased reliability helps support all of our goals. Providing additional data to us as users will help us in our efficient use of the tools. I think the transparency on the growth models and the planned distribution system upgrades is really important to support our use of it. And kind of to build on that, an integration of our growth models or some sort of way to do that. We're happy to kind of share data with where we're projecting needs that along this transportation electrification sector. And if we can use that to help make these ICA much more reliable and accurate for future planning, but then also like action upon those for where we see constraints in the grid. And if we can do proactive based on kind of the totality of all of our users' input would really help us in instead of kind of what we're seeing now, which is a hindrance of some of our goals caused by, I'll say, like grid constraints or capacity constraints. And if we can work together and collaboratively to help mitigate those or minimize those, obviously supports us as customers, but also the entire sector here. And then I'll build on that flexible loading potential. That's something we're extremely open to. I'll say, like, as an interim solution, especially, like, do want to try and make it clear that we want, you know, the load as required by our customers in the sector available to us. But as we're in this kind of interim period, it is something that we are open to exploring and talking through on a site-specific basis. Obviously, depends on like the load profile for that circuit, but also our site archetype, whether it's fleet, urban, travel, all that. But yeah, we're generally open to it as a solution to support transportation needs. We also can utilize DERs to help support in that. But again, I want to stress that I want focus to remain on like forecasting and performing upgrades required to support this electrification of transportation.
Thank you. I would like to see if anyone in the panel would like to address another panelist's comments.
Hey, Tara, I'd just like to add to Taylor's notion on forecasting, which is something that EVgo has actually already done with some of the with a couple of the IOUs, just to provide better projection on what our growth plan looks like in the next 3 years, 5 years, right? And where we're focusing those loads. I'm curious, and maybe this is towards the end of the conversation here, what value, or is there any value that the utility sees in providing that information, especially when we're planning 5 years out, and what are we doing to take action on that?
So thank you, everyone. We are a little ahead of schedule, and although we don't have Q&A built into the panel session, I'm wondering if the panelists would be open to addressing some questions. I know stakeholders have a lot of questions. Would that work? Okay, so I think I would like to ask Matthew Coldwell from the CPUC to ask his question, and then we'll move over to the chat. So please put your questions into the chat.
All right, well, thank you, Taru, for giving me the first crack at this, and so I thank the panel for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. And so, just a little context to the question that I want to ask here is, you know, this morning we heard from the utilities quite a bit about, you know, the value from their perspective that these load ICA maps provide, in particularly when it comes to their resources, and you know, these maps potentially weeding out some of the projects that, you know, aren't really viable from a utility system perspective because of capacity constraint issues, and knowing that early on, and so they don't ultimately have to review those applications. And so I think that's absolutely true, and one of the values of this tool. At the same time, you know, as a state that's really looking towards electrification as one of our key decarbonization goals, you know, we really want to see, you know, especially like on the transportation side, chargers being deployed and being built out on the utility systems to really support the transition to electric vehicles moving forward. And so, with that sort of context, really my question, and each of you sort of hit on this a little bit already, but I want to ask it a little bit more directly. It's kind of a two-part question. So the first part is, you know, at what point in your own planning processes do you actually look to this ICA tool. And this kind of gets at to the question I think Sam White had posted in the chat too. And then kind of the second question, if for any given project, if you're looking at it and you're looking at the ICA maps, and if those maps are identifying, hey, there's some kind of capacity constraint in this location, and so it requires some type of system upgrade, and that could be money and time before that project can come online. And you answer this question if you can, but do you at that point just sort of give up on the project, or do you look for a new location for the project? I'm just curious about, I know what these maps are supposed to be doing, but I'm trying to get a better sense of how they're actually being used and the impact they're having on this group of folks in your own planning and decision making. So hopefully those questions make sense, and just gonna throw it out there to whoever is interested in answering that.
I can start there for you, Matthew. On our end, we have a network plan, right? And this network plan, in essence, is it's a map of key areas where we'd like to deploy our chargers, right? And this map ultimately has a radius of 1 mile radii circles that basically identify key areas, and being able to overlay this map on top of what we have on our network plan is critical to our operation. Your other question around whether or not we stumble upon areas that are more grid constrained, I think it's more so taken upon like the strategy perspective more than anything. In areas that are a bit more grid constrained or may have some grid hardening needs, we'll plan for those at a later date and try to find opportunity nearby that may not be reflective of similar grid constraints.
I'll go next.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, thank you. So really similar with us. Obviously, we're a data-driven company, so we have similar network maps that we look at needs both like spatially and temporally. And so we do utilize ICA to try and focus our efforts for those needs where capacity is shown. Again, with our historic use with it and experience in its unreliability, our reliance on it as a tool for focusing our efforts has slipped, and we kind of look at it but don't actually make decisions based on it right now, just because we found that we just need to get it into the interconnection process, get engineering assessments done to get true data on whether or not we'll have load there. And then the second part of that was, do we abandon? Again, like with our data is driving where our needs are, and if there's not another alternative, we don't abandon projects, but we just have to plan for interim solutions or creative ways that we can fill that gap between our needs and when load is available to us.
I'd say from our perspective as a use case, slightly differently, we almost go from a bottoms up side of things, because if we have a specific fleet that may have 12 locations in PG&E service territory and 4 in San Diego and 8 in SCEs, we look at that portfolio and use ICA as one of several filters in terms of prioritization of implementation, because we are looking to try to always deploy at the customer's depot for obvious reasons, with the opportunity to maybe go offsite if we have multiple constraints against using a specific depot. But we certainly spend a lot of time on duty cycle translation to capacity planning and load shape development at a specific location where there is usually 0.5 megawatt or more of load for a fleet. And in that sense, ICA and what comes from that collaborative analysis is really important for us, because we're dealing with a subset, typically 10, 15, 20 sites within a service territory that are really high focus areas for us. So ICA should and hopefully will become much more of a leading indicator of portfolio direction for our fleet customers.
Great. Well, I appreciate the responses, and I have a thousand other questions, but I won't take up all the time. So Taru, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Tyler, can we move to the chat, please?
Yeah, I would like to check in with Sam if he still has a question.
Thank you. You partially addressed the question, but I was wondering if any of the panelists wanted to comment on the features available in the ICA, the ones which it has or the ones you wishes it had, outside of the question of accuracy, which is obviously crucial. But in your use of the ICA for being able to screen or identify potential sites rather than sites that you have already know where you want to put it and are trying to figure out whether that's good. That would include APIs or screening or sorting tools, anything like that. In short, a question of does the ICA tool currently provide you the features that make it most useful for you, or which features would you like to see if those were available?
I'll answer quickly. I think I mentioned earlier an API where we can actually do, pull down circuit available data in a secure and curated way. So we can run our own analysis to determine if we, in a sense, have our own micro IRP that we need to run for that fleet site itself and determine if there's a DER toggle that we need to include in our analysis relative to what the ICA is telling us for that circuit capacity. That would be fantastic. It actually would make the interaction with the utility, the distribution engineers, much more productive, we believe, and start from a much more well-informed position as they're looking at including our request in the queue. So we'd like to see something like that along those lines.
Would anyone else like to comment on additional features?
I'll comment more on for DER integration with it. Just having additional features like transformer information and specifications, or like excess headroom on them, any other grid infrastructure actual location nodes would be pretty helpful for us to be able to integrate these features to help support the use of DERs as a benefit to the grid where needed.
Yeah, and I think this starts to go into the next question that Tara is going to ask. But I mean, ultimately, I think the user friendliness of it is a key aspect, at least for EVgo, because it's leveraged cross functionally on our end, on the siting side, and with less technical folks, and really just the granular data that we can show in existing assets, right? Load break junctions, existing availability within, some of those assets that are in the ground currently, maybe underutilized, assets that are currently deployed, more for smaller applications, right? And this is talking about some of the lower hanging fruits, and trying to figure out, hey, are there assets currently out on the field that we can leverage, and somehow upgrade, so that we can get upwards of about a megawatts worth of load on there. Being able to be proactive and engaging with the utilities out at an early state will ultimately, I think, yield benefits on the resource end, as many of the utilities right now, I think, especially with the implementation of Rule 29, are pretty slammed with a lot of the front end resource needs.
Great. I will move on to another question from the chat. This one comes from Roger Lynn. It says, thank you, panelists. Curious if you know how new construction buildings are analyzed for load ICA, especially when they are zero net energy new construction buildings, energy efficient buildings that produce as much energy as they consume. Does anyone feel comfortable speaking to that?
So I think this panel is largely focused on the EV use case, but I'm wondering, Matt, if you're comfortable addressing this question.
From an interconnection standpoint, I don't really have much to comment on. Utilizing the ICA maps for net zero buildings, so no.
If that's the case, then I can move on to the next question.
Hey, Tyler, just would note that, maybe some of these questions around building electrification and the usefulness of these ICA maps, maybe at the end of the day today, those are some questions that we can pose to our utility colleagues, how they're thinking about that.
It's a great idea. The next question is from Sky. Have the EV charging panelists identified any difference between PG&E's results versus SCE and SDG&E results in terms of accuracy? It seems like there would be a bit of a difference in the number of potential sites with power between those territories with current results.
I can answer from our perspective. Our sample size is probably too small to do a meaningful comparison on the results vis-a-vis Teslas or EVgo's that are doing much more territory-wide implementation programs. But obviously, you're going to see better results, I think, when you have more updated load forecasts and forward-looking load forecasts and expected additions to load and changing grid configurations rather than doing retroactive reviews and sensitivity runs.
Yeah, I don't know if for EV goes in, I don't know if we've made the comparisons, and I'd be happy to check in with my team. But as far as accuracy is concerned, I think both of which actually have an annual refresh. So just given that notion that these are on the loading side, it's refreshed annually. That's kind of what creates this notion on our end of maybe not completely trusting what the ICA indicates, and more so still probing on the engineering side to see whether or not we can integrate ourselves.
Sky, does this address your question? I unmuted you.
Yeah, I guess my question is, just to be clear, and they may not have an answer to this, is that, so as we saw earlier in Edison's territory and in San Diego's territory, almost the vast majority of the nodes have no hosting capacity on them, whereas in PG&E's territory, there's a much wider spread. And so it seems to me like there would be a big difference in the ability to use the ICA to identify sites in San Diego and Edison's territory versus PG&E's based on those results. So I wasn't sure if anybody had found that it was a different, your ability to actually use the ICA to find sites was different because of those underlying baseline, what I would call accuracy issues, but people may characterize them differently.
I'll just say, like, from Tesla's perspective, I'd have to take that one offline. Most of my experiences with PG&E specifically, so I can't speak to the analysis between all three that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Taylor.
Okay, I think we can move on to a question from Bill Peter from PG&E. This one is directed specifically to Taylor. It says, you mentioned the need to submit applications to get actionable information. If load ICA can be used to streamline the early stages of the load application process, do you feel that that would provide value to your customers?
Yeah, and it's kind of what PG&E mentioned during their presentation earlier, is just the additional resource constraints of the excess applications required and the amount that end up getting canceled. So all this work then going back to nothing would help everyone. So help us as Tesla, help the IOUs and our customers just to be more efficient in order to support their needs in a more timely manner.
we have a question from Kurt Sherman, who asks, when overlaying ICA results on your own maps, do you download the data and then import them into your map, or establish an API link to the ICA results? And that's Kurt from Verdant Associates.
We do the latter. So establish an API link to the ICA results.
Any other comments on this one? Okay, then we have one last question from Ben Schwartz of Clean Coalition, asking, what are the panel's thoughts about utility timelines for ICA updates? Are they fast enough to match the pace of EV adoption?
I'd say I can start first for EV goes in. I mean, I think the rollout isn't the most favorable as far as immediate implementation. But again, all the details that were covered were certainly promising. I think I'd be more concerned around the I know it was shared in different ways between the different IOUs, but the frequency of the updates and the accuracy in what they have indicated for future load, right? So just kind of speaking to what I've mentioned and what Taylor's mentioned around some pretty significant attrition in early applications, and the utility then taking those as active load reservations, and being able to somehow weed out what would ultimately be the fallout in what the utilities see overall. I think the accuracy in the data that'll be presented will ultimately be a result of, number one, the frequency, right, and then number two, the loads that are currently reserved for the capacity. I think a quarterly refresh would be ideal from our lens. And if we can provide it at a more frequent rate, even better.
Yeah, I'll kind of echo that. The more data transparency and up-to-date info we can get, the better. We will utilize this tool as best we can as soon as we have it. So, if I could have all of these upgrades immediately, would prefer that. So I'll kind of defer to the commission and IOUs on true timelines needed to achieve these. But, the purpose of this in our eyes is to support these energization timelines. And we really think it's mutually beneficial to implement all these for everyone's goals here.
That is all the questions in chat. I also have a comment from Gabe from the CPUC saying that he's ready for his question.
Thanks, Tyler, and thanks, Taru, and thanks, panelists, for sharing your perspective. I'm going to circle back to a question I started to ask the utilities earlier about the integration of flexible load with this tool. Let's simplify it to a hypothetical here. I'm going to invent the numbers, but is it more important to you to get an ICA result that says, for example, you can, deploy 2 megawatts of charging load basically any time of the day? There's no constraint. Or would you rather get a result that said, 20 hours out of the day, you can have 3 megawatts of charging load. It's just at this other time, you would need to be reduced. Would you rather get a result that is just, sort of the worst case scenario and live with those results? Or would you rather get a result that potentially showed you greater hosting capacity, but with some constraints. And I mean, how important is it to have that functionality in this tool?
I'll start with that one. We really value both sets of the information in this hypothetical. So the baseline load is really important for us to know, but the ability to have this kind of flexible loading or dynamic loading as early as possible helps us make our like business decisions on what our stall count can be, how this supports not just this specific site, but the ability to offload resources from other sites if it can be taken care of here. And then however we need to integrate some DERs in order to mitigate like customer impact of these flexible loads. The earlier we have that information, the better we can utilize it.
I'll say from our perspective, I really appreciate this question and the way it's been presented because of our use case specifically on the fleet side, and that managed load is bread and butter for how we work with fleets every day. And so when we present a load shape back to the utility, it's implied and embedded into the load shape that we're going to shift and shape the load, primarily to drive down cost per kWh to that fleet customer as part of what we do. So we would highly encourage the ability to score potential loads added to the ICA as flexible, manageable, dispatchable, however the utilities would feel that they need to define that. We'd find that very valuable because that really creates more rigor into the decisions that Taylor mentioned. Do we do behind the meter additional capacity to serve that load on peak times, or shift load to flatten it in a way that provides better hosting capacity visibility to the utilities? So I appreciate the question a lot.
Yeah, I'd agree. You know, having that additional insight into the time-based hosting capacity is going to be really powerful, especially for fleet EVs who are going to have a large amount of controlled charging that's possible there. Maybe a little bit less applicable for the residential customers, you know, unless there's some DR aggregators that are going to be controlling them specifically. But for fleet EVs, it's definitely going to be powerful.
I will say though, on our end, that I don't know if it's a necessity within the ICAs. I'd say it's a second layer, right? Maybe, I mean, because now, you know, even with load rejections that we currently get from the IOUs, we're going back and reestablishing communication to identify any potential load ramp details that we can present them with, and trying to figure out, you know, any flexibility in our integration. To answer your question on integrating that within the current ICA maps, I wouldn't necessarily say that would be, you know, a prime ask of EVgo's end, but more so maybe just a second layer that we look at, you know, following the initial results of the ICA.
Great. Thanks for all of your perspectives there. And it sounds like there's a range of perspectives from strong interest to, you know, secondary interest. And so I'm hoping maybe in the afternoon in the Q&A session, we can pose this question again back to the utilities to hear their perspective on how they could integrate some of these concepts into the tool. So thanks for sharing that feedback. Back to you, Taro. Or Tyler, not sure who's facilitating right now.
Yeah, Gabe, Sky has Sky has a question in the chat that they would like to ask you about your hypothetical.
Sure.
So actually, can I just say something really quickly? We're very close to taking a 5-minute break. So this would be the last question we can take for this session of the panel.
Thanks, Drew. Gabe, my question was, I wanted to make sure I was understanding what your question was essentially. So the way I understood it, you were asking if the EV developers would find it helpful to be able to see ICA results on a more granular hourly basis so that they could see, you know, when they could do 3 megawatts of charging versus 2 megawatts of charging. It's my understanding that the ICA does that now. And so I didn't entirely understand if you were discussing a feature that an additional time-based feature that's not there, or what, or comparing like just changing it to a static result or something. essentially, were you asking about like what's currently there, or were you asking about it adding an additional functionality? And if so, I don't think I understand what that functionality is.
Well, having never used the tool myself, I can't say that I'm an expert at how to use it. So if what I was asking is already available, that would be great to confirm. But when I asked that this morning, I got an answer that said, "Oh, that's going to take us 5 years beyond 2024 to do." So I wasn't
Yeah.
particularly pleased to hear that. But maybe, when we get to Q&A, we can get some clarification on current capabilities. And if what I'm asking is sort of already baked in, that's good news. So why don't we confirm that from utilities during the Q&A session? Thanks for bringing
you
that
can
up.
download all 576 hours right now for the load ICA. And people should know that because it's super useful in theory.
Okay, that's great to hear.
So I want to thank all the panelists. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back around 1:48 to take the second set of questions for the panel. Hello, everyone. So maybe I can read question number 4 for this next segment, which is how can we further enhance the accuracy and usefulness of the ICA tool for DER planning, siting, and interconnection? And I know the panelists have addressed this in various ways in the previous segment, but if there's any more to say, please go ahead. So can I start with Ferdinand if he is online?
Yeah, no, I'll just reiterate, the granularity in the data that's provided in asset information, and also the increased refresh of the loading data that's provided also, and then some implementation of controls to mitigate load reservations, right? I think oftentimes there certainly is competing priorities as it pertains to load applications, and being able to somehow clean up the pipeline a bit, to make room for what would I assume would be assets that are likely to go in immediately would certainly be favorable.
I definitely would agree with Ferdinand from our side, and actually saw the question that popped up about the follow-up about interconnection analysis might not be leveraging the hourly data coming from the ICA. That's really our biggest need, I think, and the closing the loop opportunity here is to see how rigorous ICA analysis at those spot loads at those line segments could be used as a pre-screening or a filtering tool for the design engineers asked to evaluate interconnection requests. And if there's a richer data set or a richer handshake between the load side and the grid side, can that expedite certain requests once you've been able to essentially certify that the loads are either well planned out and visible and or manageable, and how does that help move things through the queue?
So I read this question a little bit differently, but to kind of carry on with the previous two panelists, the load ICA leveraging hourly based information for flexible type of devices is really important. So leveraging that knowledge into some of the screening and interconnection would be powerful. When I truly read this question, though, I was thinking more from DER planning, like the generation based. So the flip side of load based hosting capacity is generation based hosting capacity. And one further enhancement there that I just have echoed in the past is in generation based hosting capacity, we consider generation, what the maps are looking at is just generation. But there's all forms of generation, just like there is a form of load that's controlled versus uncontrolled. And from the DER planning, siting, and interconnection, you could go a whole lot deeper into what are you even doing this hosting capacity for? Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it a synchronous machine? Is it a smart inverter with a specific smart inverter characteristic? And that might even play into some of the EV chargers too, if they have some reactive power capability. Does a charger with some reactive power control capability might be able to accommodate more or less? So there's a lot of granularity within a hosting capacity study that gets actually defined in the upfront analysis. And if we're talking about improving the accuracy and usefulness, if we want to get into more of the specific characteristics of going back to controlled versus uncontrolled EV charging, there's two different results that really should be coming out of it. So there is that granularity of what are you even analyzing, which would change your results from the study.
From our perspective for the DER planning and siting interconnection, as a host of products, additional nodes of existing infrastructure information would really help us knowing what transformers there, if an upgrade would be needed to support a load side generation of it. To speak specifically to how we incorporate these at our EV charging, like everyone else has said, more granular data just helps us make these decisions. We generally consider ourselves a load, even when we have on-site generation, it's exceeded by our load for EV charging. But having that additional information and knowing how we can integrate DER to benefit us and our customers and kind of fill those gaps and needs that the grid can provide really help us to like install the support needed for all our users.
Thank you. So I'll just pause a minute to see if any of the panelists want to address something that another panelist has said. Okay, so we'll move on to question 5, and this is mainly for Matt, as it's on building electrification. So how can the load ICA data be used for siting building electrification projects? What are the existing barriers for this use case?
Yeah, thanks, Taru. And really building electrification is very similar to, say, fleet EV loads. It's large loads, it's conversion of perhaps a gas load into an electrical load at a specific site. So when you think about just as building electrification, it's new load that's coming onto the grid. In the analysis done for load ICA is right in line for building electrification, just like it is for fleet EV charging as well. There's a lot of similarities there. What's really powerful that I'd say, and I've already said it and we've talked about it, is the time-based knowledge of how much can you accommodate, because that really would drive building loads and demand flexibility perhaps at those locations. Knowledge of, well, if I just kind of vary my charging perhaps, or if I have some other capabilities of offloading, with storage locally, you could do some really neat stuff. Building electrification has that opportunity. It also informs, the hosting capacity assessment informs, say, time of use rates for buildings that are looking to electrify. What type of rate structure are they going to be looking towards? Well, what is the availability of the grid at that specific location that they're already at? So instead of trying to site something, the siting's already there. The building's there. It's just the conversion of that location from, say, gas or some other sort of alternative resource into utilizing the utility supplied electricity. And I guess the second half of that question, what are the barriers? The barriers are really just in line with fleet EV, the load ICA analysis, very similar.
Thank you, Matt. I want to ask Gabe if he has anything to add to this use case.
Are you referring to building electrification load?
Yes.
Yeah, it seems like there's different use cases. I mean, if you're talking about a brand new all electric building, I'm assuming load ICA is really not a tool that you need. It's a more of a standard new connection service application. But then if you're converting an existing building and electrifying, removing all its gas and replacing it with electric, that seems like a potential use for the load ICA tool. Do you all have perspective on sort of the different use cases related to building electrification, new build versus retrofit?
Personally, and I don't know if that question is just going to me again, but personally, I see them one of the same. New loads whether they just be a converted load or if they're totally new build. Where it gets a little bit more complicated, I would say, is if it's a new build into a whole different region, more like a greenfield type build. That's hard
what I
to
meant
do.
by new build. Yeah.
Okay.
That's
So yeah, the
completely brand
green,
new building.
right, the green field where you don't have anything existing infrastructure, then yeah, it's going to be all new developed, and that would go through a very specific process. So yeah, I see the differences between those two for sure. They're good.
Hey, Taru, since we have some time, could I also ask my fellow Matt a question here on this?
Yeah, sure.
So with building, like, so with existing buildings, most of that electrification, particularly in the near term, I mean over the next 10 years or so, is going to come from heating. So either both space and water heating. I think that's where a lot of regulations are going to be taking us. And so you'll still have gas load within those buildings, but you'll have relatively large electric loads associated with heating. And of course, those have vastly different profiles than EV charging do, right? So you're going to actually maybe be winter peaking, with space heating. You might have a winter peaking load with space heating as opposed to, a summer peaking load with AC, right? So just kind of curious, Matt, if you have any thoughts on the ICA's use of kind of the worst hour as the benchmark and how applicable that may or may not be to assessing the ability, for this particular, for space and water heating and retrofits in existing buildings, how useful that is as the benchmark.
It might be additional layers within a hosting capacity study that are required to address some of the changes of the profiles of those loads. So when you start to talk about significant profile changes and you don't have cooling of, say, transformers, then it starts to change what is the rating of those transformers and the different devices. So there is some other things that need to come into play if you are seeing a very significant jump in amounts of loads and type of profiles that are associated and the different type of equipment that's associated. Some of the fundamentals of the ICA analysis still apply. Some of the conductors, the how much thermal overload there might be on a conductor, or just the voltage type metrics as well. So there are additional layers that would come into play, things that need to consider the planing criteria that's applied by the utilities. But when it comes down to what ICA is examining right now, those metrics still apply. Are you going to see if the building converts however many horsepower or BTU of gas heat into several megawatts? How much can you accommodate and transfer over? You can calculate the electrical equivalent and see, well, is there that capacity there on the grid to be able to accommodate that? But there are implications of the profiles that do get created. I think that has to do with everything, though, even fleet EVs. If you're greatly changing the overall profile of the grid, the load profiles, that can have other types of implications.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So we are going to our last question for the day for the panel. How could the use of the Load ICA tool be leveraged to enhance the IOU's grid planning processes? Ferdinand, would you like to start?
I'd love to start on this one, Taru.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll jump.
Ahead, sorry, I was having trouble getting off mute.
Okay,
Go for it.
I'll go for it. Planning is something that I mentioned in the very first question today. Hosting capacity is evolving into that application of planning. It's a little bit different from the application space, the interconnection space, right now, where it's really primarily being used. But by knowing the grid's hosting capacity now and then comparing that to what is the growth rate of new types of loads, you can see, well, when those violations might begin to occur And that's what gives the utility a very good indication of where do we need to start really prioritizing some of the upgrades on the grid. The one difference, though, when you think about planning, is it's not the fleet EVs that really are going to be part. I shouldn't say it's not going to be part of it, but you don't know. The fleet EVs are going to be coming and they're going to show up, and that's going to impact things greatly. But when you start planning, it's what is that gradual growth, and it's the distributed EVs, the residential type EVs growing across the grid, which will require a new type of ICA analysis where we're not just doing location by location, how much can we accommodate, but rather look at a distributed amount of devices growing over time to see, well, when is the feeder going to start to see issues based off of that distributed growth over time, and seeing, well, how fast things are changing across the next 5-10 years. That's going to prioritize where the upgrades go. But again, that's a different type of hosting capacity analysis that's going to be really powerful. It's kind of coming around the corner, but it's new. Yeah. Stop there.
Yeah. So I mean, I would just echo that. This is really critical on our end too, on a network planning basis, right? As much data as the utility can provide us in trying to get more granular information on our end, and understanding where there could be some grid constraints, and then we can also then share, because we're a very data driven company on our end, what we have to the utilities, and better projecting out 3 years from now, 5 years from now, right? So that we can strategically plan with utilities, hopefully alongside with other EV service providers, in trying to identify key target areas that could potentially be of a constraint to the utility in serving us, 5 years down the road.
I agree with both Ferdinand and Matt, but also it's a different view on how the new loads should be looked at systemically, and disaggregating the forecasting process. And I think ICA was used originally to take that system forecast that's provided by the utilities every year and then shove down to the feeder level and allocate it across the feeders, and then run ICAs against those, and then taking spot use cases of added load as they know about them, thinking about this in a different way, and maybe making that system load reforecasting occur much more frequently than annually. Maybe do it quarterly, because the load growth in the pockets we're talking about, whether building electrification or EV adoption or things like what we do in the fleet side, is going to happen more frequently than that. And I think the overall re-rack of the ICA from a system level should happen more frequently. And then it allows you to invite folks that have more data about the loads they're going to add to meet the ICA where it lives. And if you want 576 load shapes at the feeder segment, we will provide them to you, whether an estimate based on what public charging looks like, or specifically based on what a specific use case is going to give you. So I think it gives the utilities the right to ask for more granular data, and folks to bring a little more rigor to their time series projections.
I think I'll be repeating what was kind of just said by everyone, but like generally, yeah, we think that this could be a really great tool to leverage for grid planning. I think the actual integration of that is needed, and so we can see where there's capacity constraints showing on ICA maps, and where upgrades are likely needed to support transportation electrification. It's important, like especially given the state's ambitious goals for this sector, that utilities get ahead of capacity upgrade needs so that capacity constraints don't continue to slow down EV charging deployment. And these delays result in the shortage of our needed infrastructure and frustration for drivers who rely on this critical infrastructure. I think, as kind of mentioned before, we as a group are willing to share our future projection data and our network mapping to the utilities to help guide those planning processes, but want to also make sure that we are looking at, even on busy travel corridors, I'll call out Central Coast along Central Valley along I-5, These travel corridors that are served by one or two substations, if we see that it's currently capacity constrained, like we should be planning for upgrades now, because we know that these are lengthy upgrades and are needed in order to support the state's goals.
Thank you. So those are all the questions we have for the panelists, and thank you very much for your expertise and your answers. We're a little ahead of schedule, so if everyone on the panel is able to stay until 2:30, perhaps we could open it up to questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can take a look at the first one here. It's a question from Rob Peterson at the CPUC. In what ways would the new hosting capacity use case be combined with load ICA and gen ICA? If we want to unmute Rob, you can come on and
Yeah, the way I'm thinking about this is that hosting capacity, when that phrase is used, especially when we're talking about question 6, is that it's not just about load anymore. It's about having information about load capacity as well as how gen can play a role in addressing it. So I think of hosting capacity as being like an ICA hosting capacity use case. And I'm not sure if that's what others are thinking too, or if I'm off track, or does that make sense?
I'll start off commenting to that there, Robert. That's a good point. You know, from a planning perspective, you might want to account generation growth to help support load growth as well. When you start to think from a planning perspective, that makes sense. You got to look through a lot of different scenarios and considering the help of generation to accommodate load and the help of load to accommodate generation. And that is a different type of use case than when you're talking about interconnection, because when you're thinking about interconnection, you might not expect that that load is going to be there, or that forecasted load is going to be there to support the generation and vice versa. So by combining the two from a planning perspective is probably more palatable.
When I've asked this question before, the general response is that would be really hard. You know, that's kind of the basic response. And so maybe you weren't thinking of that. It doesn't sound like you were when you were talking about a distributed load ICA type of use case.
Well, from a planning, so getting to a planning perspective and thinking about, say, 2 to 3, 4 years out, 5 years out, those are the considerations that you need to start thinking about of it's going to be a much more different system, in that time frame. You probably also want to look at, well, what if there was no load growth? How much generation could you grow or accommodate, and vice versa? How much, if there were no generation growth, how much load could you accommodate? But then you're kind of working within this envelope of extremes, and that's where the planning starts to make the decisions of, well, does it make sense? Do we need to make these upgrades? And it gets to more like probabilistic type studies, but that's the planning atmosphere compared to more or less the interconnection type study. But those things are considered. I mean, combining those and looking at the different scenarios that start to play out becomes much more important.
I think there's a question/comment from Sam White.
Oh yes, I see this was from, I believe, the first half of the panel in response to Sky. Following up on the question for IREC, ICA may provide hourly data, but interconnection analysis may not utilize this data. Did we want to expand on that?
Yes, thank you. That was following up also on Gabe's question earlier. Just to note that there's a difference between what the ICA information is available, and it does have the 576 hourly data for both load and generation capacity. But that's different than the issue of using the data in the actual engineering for the interconnection application. And there's been an ongoing effort and some commitment from the from the commission to allow use of a limited generation profile for based upon no ICA data in evaluation of generation interconnection requests for distributed generation. And there's the opportunity to consider something similar for load, where you have variable or controllable load, as we spoke earlier. But it's differentiating between the data available through the ICA and the use of that data in interconnection and tariff agreements and interconnection agreements. And while I'm here, though, I'd also just like to mention on a related matter, which I was just about to put into chat, the opportunity as we are looking at the need for storage, on the grid, and the opportunity to utilize storage distributed throughout the grid as a both as a grid upgrade as well as a general storage capacity, because of the ability to have localized load absorption, or generation absorption as a mitigating factor, and how we might consider that as a grid asset, which would be incorporated into ICA analysis and interconnection agreements in the future. I don't think that's something that the ICA is currently designed to incorporate.
Thank you. Those are very interesting points.
And by the way, it gets Sam White for 350 Bay Area as a ratepayer environmental advocate organization.
Does anyone have any response to that, or any more questions to ask in the chat?
Like where it's going, certainly, it lends itself to the ICA being that stair step toward a distributed resources planning mentality between load and gen, and trying to run analyses inclusive of both. So we like where that question is leading, and hopefully that can be accommodated in sooner than the next 5 years after the next 4.
Okay, we have another question in the chat from Bill Peter of PG&E. Do the panelists have any feedback on PG&E's interim portal suggestion for a pop-up that would give directional information to improve guidance to customers that are looking to site their new load, based on combining load IC data and other data sources, for example, applications, forecasts, and planned projects?
I like the idea a lot. It's definitely incremental improvement, and it follows that decision logic that we, I think, as investors in behind the meter infrastructure and load build, certainly appreciate. So it adds a level of granularity and decision support versus pure interpretation. So we're fans.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Like high level, the more data transparency and assistance we can have in making our decisions, obviously we will welcome and appreciate that it's like an interim solution that can be implemented a little bit quicker than the rest of these. Something we're really hopeful we can utilize.
I'll echo the same sentiment on EVgo's end. I think it's helpful that ultimately there's increased transparency and on understanding what the potential decision would be. Whether or not that would take away from our submittal still is the bigger question, to reduce the quantity that we submit to Pacific Gas and Electric. And I think until, you know, it's proven, we may still take the route of making the submittal into the engineering group.
Tyler, it seems like we're at the end of our chat questions.
Mhm.
So we have a second poll on use cases that I think this would be a great time to do. Robert, are you here?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
I just did all attendees. Now I'll do all panelists. For those of you that weren't able to participate in the first question, just wanted to let you know we definitely value your opinions. If you have a secondary device, a phone, or a secondary screen that you can open and go to www.menti.com, or you could use that link I just posted into the chat room. And there's a question for you to answer. That asks for a code number. That code number is 7527-7559. And I'm going to send that out. And what this is doing is, well, once again, we value your opinions, and we would like to know what is an important use case of the load ICA data and maps. And you can type your answer. We did do it in a word cloud, so the most popular answers will grow. And then I will share the results with you here in a second. Just want to make sure everybody got all the information. I do see answers coming in, trickling in. This is one way we can, make sure that we want to make sure that today is valuable. Everybody's engaged in. So, and yes, you can actually put more than one answer. But once again, we value your opinion. What is an important use case of the load ICA data or maps? And I'm going to share what's coming in. Looks like number one is interconnection.
Interconnection, yes.
Seems like that's the big one.
Siting is getting big.
Yeah, and I see some, and sometimes it's just wording too. I see EV interconnection, automated interconnection, automation, I think that is. EV charging planning. Electrification is getting a little bigger, automated interconnection. Siting.
DER siting.
DARE siting. All right. Looks like about 1/4 of you have commented. And once again, these are anonymous, so we won't know who said what. So feel free to put in your opinion of what is an important use case of the load ICA data and maps.
So I saw storage, which is very interesting, and I did see building electrification as well, which is great.
Grid improvements, forecasting, investment, load management. Still, interconnection seems to be the number one priority or the number one use case. Siting is starting to catch up a little bit. Site evaluation, distribution planning. Right, looks like we're stuck on 24, so I think everybody who's going to connect is going to. You want, oh, we got one more that just came in. These are going to trickle in, and I will send these slides to you, Haru. So if you want to share with the group later on, you can share the results, and I can leave this open for another 5 minutes or so.
Thank you, Robert. This is great. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. Robert, can people still send more responses in over the next 5-10 minutes? Because we'll be going on break and they can continue to do that.
Yes, I'm going to leave it open. And so I'm going to leave it just open. In fact, if you guys are on break, I can just leave my computer on so they can see the results and how they're contributing to the results as they come in over break. And then you can put the time that you want them back in the chat room.
That sounds great. Thank you for your help. So we are a little ahead of schedule, but we can go ahead and take a break. It's 2:25 and we will come back at 2:35. Thank you. So we still have interconnection at number 1, followed by siting and DER siting, followed by grid planning and planning for the key use cases for the load ICA data.
That's correct. Did you want to see the results of the other one too?
That would be wonderful. The earlier question.
Yes. Oh, I
Changed a
will
lot.
have to do my investigation here and find out what happened because you had 33 responses. So they must have come earlier. So I apologize for that. So there's that one, and then I'll have to go find the other responses. But I do believe that there was about 33 answers that came in, of which 50 to 60% of them said that they were either familiar or very familiar with the topic.
So I think we had some fairly experienced users of ICA here today. Thank you again, Robert. So we are on to our Q&A session, and we will be taking questions in the chat. These are older instructions. Well, no, Tyler has updated them. These are the new instructions where you send your chat questions to all panelists. And since we have many individuals who could potentially answer the questions, it could be CPUC, the panelists, or the IOUs, please state in the body of your question who this question is for. And the host will read your question and allow the panelists to answer.
I do have some backdated questions, and I can choose ones that do have specific targets for them. So I can start with one. I did not capture who it was from, but it's from Clean Coalition. And it says, has Southern California Edison drawn any conclusions about the effects of system-wide erroneous data on applicant numbers? Do we have any representatives of the SCE?
Celine.
You know, Tyler, we may not have Selena available. She was the one who gave our presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
this is Lesia.
oh, Lesia. Okay, great. Lesia, are you able to address the question?
So we're going through the system-wide refresh for the Gen ICA to improve upon the issues that we identified in root cause analysis. And we're still continuing with the interconnection process. So we're still compliant with the Rule 21 screen-in process because we have an internal process of how we provide the data. And therefore, I don't think I would have that data readily available. And I don't think that we are having this particular issue. Now, we're targeting to complete the system-wide refresh as soon as possible, and we're providing those updates to the CPUC on a monthly basis. In January and February, we exceeded our expectations in processing the number of circuits that we had originally anticipated. So we're about halfway done. And yes.
I see it. Selena is available now, Lesia, so she may be able to say a bit more.
Can maybe the person who's asking the question provide a little bit more context?
I think this may have been Ben Schwartz from Clean Coalition.
Yeah, and this is Ben Schwartz. I'm the policy manager for the Clean Coalition. The reason I asked the question is I've used the ICA maps on a couple different instances since the data refresh began, and I've encountered, SCE's notification, that this data is not necessarily correct and should not be relied on for the interconnection process on those maps. And so I'm curious whether there have been instances where parties have relied on that information as the basis for their application, or you have had increased customer outreach or complaints related to that. In particular, the last word cloud showed that the ICA maps are key for DER siting and interconnection. I think those were the top two words. So I was just wondering, what the effect has. Surely there has been an effect. I'm just wondering if you've had any indication or studied it or quantified it.
I don't think we did any studies to quantify that. I mean, that error message is there to inform folks that if you did find issues in the root cause analysis and we're working to resolve them, as soon as we refresh that particular circuit, the error message goes away. So, if you're halfway done, then halfway of the circuits shouldn't show that error message anymore. And as we get closer in the process, then that error message will go away. And eventually, when we're done with the system refresh, then we shouldn't see any more of those error messages. Now, if that particular circuit is going through an interconnection process, then we have an internal way of triggering the refresh of the data so that our DGI team uses the most up-to-date information and the interconnection process still can continue. So we're not putting a pause or a stop on the interconnection process. Now, in terms of customer complaints, I think we have like a Dr. PEP inbox, ICA inbox. I haven't heard any major complaints, but I mean, I can take an action item to scout out more with the team and see if there have been questions like this.
To continue moving back from the questions that were asked towards the beginning of the workshop, this one also comes from Ben Schwartz, asking specifically to PG&E. Does PG&E specifically request the reason that an applicant chooses to move forward with an application?
This is Ed from PG&E. So the question is, if there is an interconnection request, do we request for the customer to move forward with the application? Can you clarify this question?
This is Ben Schwartz. I apologize. This was in the context of a statement made earlier by one of PG&E's presenters, and I forget exactly what it was, but he was stating some of the reasons that interconnection applications have not moved forward, based on ICA data. Or other factors that the engineering team uses to review an interconnection application. And so I was just wondering, what type of information PG&E is collecting about the customer reasons for withdrawing an application. And if I recall, I believe the specific context was with EVs and EV application attrition.
Yes, so I talked about EV load applications. Last year we had 600 EV load applications. From that, 1/3 of those applications were withdrawn before moving forward into the utility design phase. And also from there, half of those applications did not move to construction phase due to real estate and supply chain issues. I need to take this question. Your question is what kind of information and how we gather that information from our customers, right?
Just specifically whether customers are asked about their experience and what stopped them from moving forward. So yeah, yes, I guess.
Yeah, majority of the issues that we've heard was real estate competition and also supply chain issues recently from COVID happening and after that.
And so you survey each applicant to get that information is what I'm asking.
that time I need to check with our service planning team because this information was gathered with service planning team. I need to get back to you with those answers.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate the availability of that data. It's very helpful.
I have a question from Ferdinand from EVgo, who asked, will revisions include any context on active grid hardening activities, i.e. planned substation upgrades or feeder upgrades? This would make for improved network planning on the developer end. Ferdinand, did you want to continue with this question?
I believe Southern California Edison answered it, in their context, but I'm curious about the other two IOUs, if there's much planning around that.
Fernand, would you mind open up your question, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's really around, if there's any grid hardening activities that, are currently in process, waiting for funding. For example, you guys have a feeder that is being, installed for other new services, along with maybe ours that's currently in reservation and or substation upgrade happening in the upcoming years. Will those details be highlighted in the data that you present?
Yes, for the interim solution, if you recall our last slide, we will be considering our capacity projects moving forward, looking forward. So that we will consider in our interim solution, as well as in our load IC refinements. That is one of the 5 pieces of data that will be included in our inputs and assumptions for load IC refinements.
This is Haley from Sinego, and to that question, if a distribution system upgrades comes out of those efforts with the approved construction schedule and also in service date within the first year of the DPP planning horizon, it would be modeled in our base model for load ICA calculation. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, to clarify, we also will consider 1 year into planning horizon.
Another question from Sam White for 350 Bay Area. This touches on something that was mentioned a lot during the panel. Sam says, IPER provides system level forecasts, but please address how IOUs are utilizing data to forecast locational concentration of new loads, including electric vehicles.
Tyler, is this directed to anyone in particular?
Directed to the IOUs. So
IOUs, any of them? Okay.
yeah, if any have any comments on this. I guess maybe on a more fundamental level, is data, do the IOUs use data to forecast locational concentration of new loads?
So this is Ryan with SCE. I'll say at a very high level, yes, we do use information from third parties, as long as we can corroborate the information to help us forecast specific locational concentrations like you're mentioning.
Can you provide any information on how that is done?
I don't really want to talk about the details of the IPER process on this call. I guess just to note that at least within SCE, whenever we know of known projects and forecasts for known projects, then we will forecast them and we'll try to utilize them with hyper whenever appropriate.
This is Sam White. That was a question from this morning that came through, and I will say I got a response from Jan Strack, I think at PG&E. I'm sorry, for SDG&E, mentioning that this is done largely through the grid needs assessment report process, where there's the initial disaggregation of IPER results, and that's also an opportunity to incorporate other individual IOU grid planning assessment of needs. But it wasn't clear to me, at least prior to that, even necessarily after, how that grid needs assessment data is incorporated into the ICA, because that's quite different than just taking the sort of, we used to call it peanut butter approach of the IPER data that's non-locational. If anyone had an additional follow-up.
Go for you.
And it sounds like we're having trouble hearing
Yeah.
you.
Let me. Is this better?
Still having a hard time.
Yeah, not quite.
I don't know what the problem is. Sorry.
I'm wondering if we have someone else from San Diego on who can relate what Jan might have been saying. A colleague of his, maybe.
I
San
see
Diego.
with me. Ari, this is Yi. So I would like to clarify something, Sam. I don't think that we were intending to say that we use GNA as a data input. What I was saying is that when we take the disaggregated forecast as the input into our load ICA calculation, is done in a similar fashion of GNA. And I wouldn't really think that's a simple peanut butter spread type of approach, right? When we take the IPER forecast, which is on the system level, there is the disaggregation approach that really takes into consideration of a locational impact, and it's further down and disaggregated down to the circuit level. So does that answer your question?
Well, not really. I mean, it does confirm that you're not. It's making some of the link between the sort of statewide values that the IPER produces and how that's applied, locally in trying to disaggregate it, but it doesn't say much about how that's done. But I don't know if we need to go into much more discussion of that right now. But it's certainly, very relevant, for the ICA, as well as, of course, for grid planning, to understand, where the load is expected to appear and when, both load and generation resources.
So, is this better?
Yes.
I changed setting too many buttons. So yeah, so he pretty much covered it, but I would add that if you want more details, look at our GNA report that describes how we do the disaggregation. And the other thing I would add to that is that we do include known loads as well for year one. So to that extent, the locational impact of known loads are factored into the loads that we use.
Thank you, Jan. Is that true for the other IOUs as well?
So this is Bill Peter with PG&E, and so Phil to jump in. So first, with the ICA data that we currently have, that's based on historical AMA data. So we're talking here about forecasting. So I think we're talking about what's coming in terms of ICA refinements. The idea with the ICA refinements is to, and also the use cases we talked about, is kind of linking up our planning, what our engineers are using in their forecasting with the ICA data. And so to the extent that we are incorporating that EV disaggregation, that's going to flow through to the ICA. And so we do base it off of the IVM, the IPER, but we do have like propensity models that are helping us on that disaggregation. So it's kind of a mix of top down and bottom up to actually do look at where do we think the EV is going to come. And that'll flow through the planning process and then into ICA. But to be clear, like right now, and this is partly what I think part of the frustration with customers is that like ICA is looking at historical data. So we just want to make sure we're talking about like future ICA versus what's on the maps currently.
Yeah, and this is Ryan with SCE. Pretty much exactly what Bill was stating with PG&E is SCE's current state of ICA versus the GNA, which is a forecast.
Yeah, as we presented earlier, IOUs are in slightly different places on some of the components of the modeling refinement, right? So for SCE, that is currently modeled in our load ICI, but I understand it's different for the other IOUs.
Thank you, each. It's good to have the clarification of the interaction of planned interaction of the GNA methodology with the ICA.
Great. The next question is from Micah Wolford with the CEC, who says, "It is my understanding that the ICA data only go as far as showing information for primary distribution components. Are there plans to increase the geospatial resolution of the ICA data, for example, secondary distribution circuits or transformers?" And I think this can really go to anyone.
Hi, this is Belinda Vivas from SCE. No plans on showcasing any type of equipment into our portals. We see that as a security concerns. So for now, we will continue showing it as is. And we do show three-phase at an elevation of 0.6 miles. If you are to zoom in a little bit more, you'll be able to see the non-three-phase lines. But that is our plan as far as how much we are showing.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear someone.
Okay, sorry. I was trying to unmute. This is Selene with Southern California Edison. Our ICA models currently include all, three-phase loads. We do include in the topology, you may see, some radials. The secondaries are a little bit, more involved. So currently there is no plan because it's dependent on the mandates, right? So in the future, if there is a mandate, maybe we could, explore that as an opportunity.
This is E from SCG&E. We're in a similar situation. Our focus now is to finish implementing the refinements modeling changes. There's no plan to add additional maps in our ICA portal.
And for PG&E, same, we're focused on the primary system, and our use case as well is really focused on the primary system. When we talk about capacity planning, that's also done on the primary, and then in terms of the streamlining the interconnection process, we're envisioning doing that on the primary system. So no plans at this time to try to do a secondary and on that secondary system.
Okay. The next question is from Sky from IREC, who asks, "Is there a reason that customers cannot compare their own load curve with the 576-hour analysis?"
Can we know a little bit more about what the question, some context to the question?
Yeah, Sky, are you able to provide?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already gone through this. Again, there were continuing to be multiple statements that the difference between the ICA and the study process, particularly in SDG's comments, was that the study process takes into account the customer's load profile, essentially. But my understanding, and we confirmed this through Gabe's question a minute ago, is that the ICA provides you an hourly analysis, 24 hours for each of the 12 months, that would enable you to do that same look at what your load is going to be and what the constraints are based on that. I think that we've talked about that already. I think the question to the utilities is more what steps the utilities need to take at this point to allow a customer to propose something like a limited load profile that is using controlled, certified control techniques or other methods to say we will conform to that ICA profile, and what steps would be needed from a process standpoint as well as a technical standpoint to actually allow that use case, which multiple of the EV developers expressed interest in.
Just chiming in, thank you, Sky. I think that's what I was trying to get at. So you've articulated it well. So thank you for bringing that into this discussion.
This is Ryan with SCE. I could speak to it kind of at a higher level, but this workshop I don't think is the appropriate workshop to talk about managed charging. So for those that are not aware, we are working with AV vendors, all the utilities in different workshops to try to come to see how we would allow for managed charging to occur. But in order for a utility to accept managed charging, there needs to be a national standard, and there needs to be a way to certify and test the equipment by the vendor. And we just don't have that yet. I have colleagues within SCE's utility that are on the technical side working with IEEE, other standard bodies, as we get those standards developed and approved and the ability to test and certify. I believe utilities will begin to utilize some type of manage or control charging system from a vendor. And then I think we can see about how do we incorporate that into some type of ICA process within our public portals.
Does it make sense, Ryan? Why do it one and then the other? Because that looks to me like 5 to 8 years out. What about doing it simultaneously, ensuring that the ICA has its capability that's needed while you work on the certification? We've learned that it's a long process to get any changes to the ICA, and if this is a clearly identified use case, which you've said it is, I'm not sure I understand why we would wait on the ICA. And I think this is the forum to discuss what is needed for the ICA.
Well, I guess my answer to that question would be, as we're continuing to work on these ICA enhancements, I believe we're always going to provide a profile. So you, the customer, can utilize that profile, and then you use whatever managed or modulated profile that you want to try to see what the results might be. And then to me, that's how the customers can utilize ICA in terms of the data that we provide.
Okay, so are you saying you have confidence in the data such that a customer who's connecting to the primary system could apply for interconnection using a managed load profile based on the ICA profile provided?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, as we continue to work on these ICA enhancements, we can have that discussion as those are beginning to be implemented.
Sorry, Sky, just want to jump in here. This is E from SDG&E. I feel like we're kind of talking about two different things here, right? One is ICA having the sort of the hourly based low profile, which you had mentioned that it's already available to download in the ICA portal. But if we're talking about in the interconnection process space, allowing a profile-based interconnection application, that's a whole nother level of like policy and discussion, technology discussion. That I know Ryan mentioned the charging standards as one example, but there's a lot more than that, right? Like, because right now there's no rule or tariff governing this type of application. there's no way for utility to have confirmed sort of load, right? If someone included a load application with the charging or even just the profile they're willing to follow, how does that get informed, going forward? There's just a lot to be discussed. And that's the area that Ryan was talking about earlier. That doesn't seem to be sort of consistent with the objective of this load ICA workshop, because it's way beyond that.
I think it's
I
up
would
to the
agree.
PUC to decide that, but I think that the biggest bubble in our thing was interconnection and allowing people to do that. So I think that we're here to talk about how the ICA can enable interconnection of loads. And I didn't see anything that said we're only talking about static loads. So I think that this is the forum to talk about the ICA components. I agree, obviously, and I'm deeply familiar with the fact that we will have to do a lot of other process elements, including making sure there's reliable techniques for controlling the load. But if the ICA data is going to be used, that's what my question is are we comfortable that the ICA capabilities provide the data that would be needed to enable that?
So this is Bill Peter with PG&E. I can speak for PG&E on this. So I would, so first I would say that we are targeting interconnection as our primary use case. And, but as we talked about before, at least in the near term, we're not targeting this flexible load management use case for ICA and interconnection in the near term. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think we talked about how we feel like there's a lot of other things that need to happen. And ICA is just data, right? And so if you don't have the other things there, we can't really use the data in any meaningful way that the other utilities spoke to. But to come into your second question of like, okay, when we look further out, when all that stuff is taken care of, like, do we feel the ICA data is at a point that it can be used for that? I think for PG&E, I would say no, it's not at that point right now. It's historical looking. There's a lot of validation we'd have to do. So to the extent we're talking about like longer term, I think from PG&E's position, we see some potential value in load ICA on this use case. We just are also hearing, like, when we think about the near term, like the customer engagement workshop, we hear about like, we want to get improved load application process, right? Like they just want, they're not trying to do siting, they're not trying to do load, they just want a better service to our customers. And so like, we're really focused like in the near term, how can we provide better service to the customers? But I think to the extent that this workshop is to try to drive like, okay, what's the long-term vision? Then I would say that, yeah, we would be open to like, how do we get load ICA ready for that longer term? Because we do see the potential there. It's just what we're seeing right now with our customers is different, like what's needed right now. So that's why we proposed that more, static type use case.
And I would agree. Where we're at right now with load ICA, right? Historically speaking, this before my time, there was never a consensus really on how load ICA was supposed to be panned out in terms of how Gen ICA was really worked in such a way such that it became part of the mandated CPUC directed use for generation interconnections in Rule 21, right? We don't have a unilateral governing tariff for all types of load interconnection, which is an added complexity, right? So all of these questions, that you're posing, they're actually very valid, very pointed, really good questions that I think, from a long-term vision would, be very useful for all, internal and external. But are we there yet right now, today? We're not. I think the load ICA refinements that we're all proposing from a utility perspective gets us orders of magnitude closer to that vision, right? But there's also other questions that need to also be respectfully thought out, right? In terms of resilient planning, right? Some of the questions that you posed regarding the flexible loading and, you know, maybe I'm not using the right terminology, but basically, you know, having the loads fluctuate so much, right? For the current rules, there may be implications, right? We don't understand what those implications are. And from a utility standpoint, we're held to that compliance to that current tariff. So a lot of these questions that we have been posing here are very great questions. But just as a reminder, you know, the utilities are still held to comply with the current tariff rules, right? And the current tariff mandates. And so a lot of what you're asking for is definitely, the step in the right direction where we want to head to. It just will take some collaboration and effort in order to make sure that we have the tariffs in place, the regulatory infrastructure to sustain that, and for us to work towards that path, if that's the path that we collectively want to work towards.
Thanks, all. I guess I think that's what I thought we were here to do a little bit, and I really appreciate both those responses. They were very helpful in terms of where you guys sit.
Yeah, I'll add one other thing just from when we're talking about like, is ICA data ready? It doesn't. So, we still have engineers, right? When you submit your load application, like I think that step may be a lot more feasible, or like having so when we say like, oh, we want ICA data to do this for us, that's a very specific thing versus saying, okay, we want to have this load flexibility possibility and interconnection is a separate. Now, ICA could be part of the solution to get us there, but doesn't have to be.
Yeah, that's very true. Taru, I had another comment and question. Should I save that, or am I in the queue still on that?
Yeah, Sky. So I'm seeing other questions come in. If you could let Tyler get through a few more questions, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I get my opportunity.
Yeah, we have the next question from Zoe Harold from Green Power Institute, who posed this waiting for all three utilities to be able to respond. And it's a bit of a lengthy question, but I will read it here. Can the IOUs quantify the statement directional understanding based on the deviation between vintaged ICA results and interconnection study results? To put this another way, how often does an ICA result correctly predict or inform available interconnection capacity for actual interconnection requests? Since this is the use case, there's a need to measure and quantify if the intended application works based on the current ICA version, including the calculation method, for example, uniform load profile. Is a comparison of ICA interconnection study results available, including for different types or categories of interconnection requests?
So
The first question, sorry, before we answer that question, when you say interconnection, which side are you actually referring to? The generation side or the load side?
I do not see that specified, but I would assume this would be load.
Who is the person asking the question again?
This is Zoe Harold.
Okay, let me see if. Okay. Zoe, would you like to clarify your question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, so load, since we're focused on load in this workshop.
Zoe, would you like to kind of repeat and summarize the question?
So I think, we heard from developers in the panel and that they would use the ICA essentially to help inform where to site their EV charging station products. And a lot of what we heard was that the ICA load values essentially ended up not accurately informing where they could site their products without requiring upgrades. So my question is, have we actually looked at the data of the ICA results and how those results compare with then when projects are submitted and the outcome of the interconnection study of those load projects? And if the ICA result in that location would have informed whether or not upgrades would be needed.
To kind of level set, I think that we first have to realize that the load ICA is in a different state of maturity than Gen ICA, right? Where what you just described, it would be what you would expect for like a Rule 21 interconnection, seeking to interconnect and using ICA data, right? For load interconnections, we are not there yet in terms of the load ICA usage of the data. For SE, it's historical in nature. We don't include currently planned projects or planned, load interconnections, right? The generation interconnection planning is very different than the distribution system planning for load. These processes are completely different, have different assumptions, have different interconnection paths, if you will, right? And so I think that with the load refinements, we will be able to get there. But where it could help today would be in efforts to help with siting. It could be directional in nature, where you could look at the maps, see where there's potential, where a location may be have reserve capacity, and then submit your pre-application. And then that's the way that we could help with the siting processes, with our customers submitting the application at that point in time. And then as the load ICA use case, if you will, matures, we will be able to get there.
I mean, it still seems like,
at least from an Edison perspective.
I can weigh in from PG&E's perspective if you want. So we are not tracking that type of data, nor are we recommending its use like that. So basically the way load ICA data right now is, we wouldn't expect it to be accurate if we're basically saying this ICA data should be a replacement for the load application process in isolation, this load ICA data. And in fact, so what we're proposing is that we now use load ICA data with other data as part of the interconnection process to improve that process. And we think that that's really so I think directionally, sure, but when we talk about accuracy, saying, is this going to end up as the same outcome? So I mean, the metric, we wouldn't, if the idea there is that now we're going to achieve 100% of replacement for load interconnection, we think that that's not what ICAs should be shooting for. And so we would probably think there would be different metrics that would be more appropriate. And then remember, I also have think about how many projects drop out and all the changes. Most load interconnection customers is a very iterative process when we're working with them in that application stage, as kind of say described before. And so even what is the load application that you're comparing against versus what they ended up with? So so we're not tracking it, and the reason is that we're at least right now we're kind of focused on a different type of use of the load ICA data than what you kind of were laying out. That's at least our current position.
Clarify, because I'm not implying that the ICA load data should be used essentially in lieu of the interconnection study. But I think what we heard is that even directionally for Tesla, they're not able to use the ICA load data. And so if it's not a good directional indicator of siting or interconnection, I think we need to know how poorly it is functioning even as a directional indicator.
Got it. So you're talking about the siting use case versus the interconnection is kind of how I'm hearing it. And I see what you're
And siting leading to interconnection applications.
Yeah. So I would think that given that load ICA is historical, probably, that's probably why people are saying it's not accurate. So to the extent that we can show how the refinements might improve that, if that's what people are meaning when they say it's not accurate, that might be getting to part of it. But just to be clear, that's not, at least at this point, where we're at least PG&E is proposing, we're really focused on, that's not where we're undertaking. Our current efforts are not focused on like trying to improve the accuracy of that. They're focused on trying to improve the interconnection process. But it may have that secondary benefit.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to try and get through as many of these as we can. The next is from James Seaver from Public Advocates. Following up on the question about the refinement implementation timeframe, which extends to 2025 or 2026, is it possible that GNA analysis could be used and supplemented to provide circuit segment node load ICA results? Forecasted DER load growth and known load growth is included in GNA analysis to allocate DER demand to circuits and inform the schedule for necessary upgrades. Extending to a 5-year time horizon, it also includes engineering review. The ICA portal does not need to be reinvented, just modified. Annual interim connection applications can be supplemental to this analysis and be included in the annual refresh.
I can take this question from SCE. I think there's definitely potential on the GNA side to provide this data. It's currently at the circuit and substation level, so this is where it would have to be. What we're doing at SCE is we're taking that data and we're updating it on a monthly basis to understand what is the updated reserve load capacity for that year, considering new load growth projects coming into the picture. And we're doing that for the circuit and the substations. That's what we call the PSA layer. So there seems to be potential from that data, to Jim's point.
This is Said from PG&E. We also on the same page, the interim solution that we proposed using ICA data, forecast data, projects data. The forecast and projects data is somehow the proxy of GNA data coming from our load seer tool. So in order to more frequently update it, we're not going to use directly GNA information, but it is a proxy of our GNA and ICA, GNA data, basically, GNA and EDOR data. So we do see a value for sure, and we're trying to supplement basically our ICA data with this information for better helping our customers.
Yeah, Ely from CGN here, and I gotta admit that I didn't fully understand the question, because currently there is a GNA data layer that provides the GNA data, and that's also capturing the annual GNA report. So I would say, to the extent of having the data available, it's already available to be used in sort of conjunction with the ICA, both ICA results. But I don't know if the question, whoever asked the question wants to come on mute, off mute, if you have any follow-up question there.
Yes, that was James Sievers.
Okay, James, you're unmuted.
Yes,
I'm just kind of speaking about the ICA tool that's supposed to be, I mean, right now it's just a point in time tool. And we're talking about making this be more of a forecasting tool to help customers so that in lieu of the, you know, the study, the interconnection study, before they even get to that point, they're able to look on a circuit and see if there is, you know, possible capacity within that circuit. And yeah, I know the GNA data is already included, but that's just at the circuit and substation level. And what I'm saying is that that data is informed by the EPR process in the disaggregation of all load as it's forecast by the CEC to individual circuits. They and in the process of doing that, surely the engineering analysis is going to the nodal, to the line segments to be able to inform, you know, when this circuit is going to be potentially overloaded. And so it seems to me that being that process, that forward-looking process on a 5-year time horizon is already in place, that, you know, we can extend that process to the ICA process and use, I mean, because the portal is a wonderful tool, but it's just so limited in its ability for load approximation. It's great for generation, but load approximation is terrible, and it seems like it could be very easily modified, you know, and it seems to me like it wouldn't take 3 to 4 years to do this. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, so this is Bill Peter with PG&E. I guess I would just try to maybe explain why it's maybe more of an undertaking than you're kind of describing it. You know, I would say that, you know, from our perspective, our ICA data is actually like kind of cutting edge. We feel like it's accurate for what it was designed around. And we do see value in improving the load ICA. And so, you know, the kind of what we described as the steps we're taking and working with the vendors so that they are developing their software faster. I mean, these are the planning tools that are used by utilities also, and we're driving them to develop their tools faster. So I do think this is on the front edge. I do think that we probably have the same like long-term vision, but it's also like making sure that like people are clear that it's not going to be like a replacement for engineering. Like it's, you know, it's also like even doing that type of steps, it's going to help the engineering and that load interconnection process. So I would say, and the other thing to remember is that ICA is expensive. It's very computationally intensive. It takes, you know, if you had it running on one computer, it would take, you know, I forget, I was like years to run it over on our whole system. So it's not like a simple little exercise. So I can understand how parties would want this capability yesterday. And maybe looking back, like maybe, you know, we also got to remember, like we really prioritized Gen ICA, like looking back 6 years ago, maybe that we should have been prioritizing load ICA more, but that's done, right? And so we're trying to move as fast as we can, but it is a complex exercise. And I think we are actually like on the cutting edge of developing these tools and capabilities.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not a large endeavor. What I'm saying is and that it is not expensive. I think that, you know, most of the SCE and PG&E are estimating, I think, $15 to $20 million for these refinements, I think, at least initially. But you know, it is not accommodating the use case for which it was an original, you know, at least as far as load is concerned, it's not I mean, we've heard from 4 different aggregators that are trying to use it for their purposes, and they've all indicated that they can't rely on that data to help them with their business model. And so it just seems like the process, even though we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've already have this process in place. The engineering is to develop the GNA forecasting process is already in place. And granted, the IEPR forecasting process for electric vehicles is still has a lot, the way it's done is not done on nearly a granular enough level, and there is work in process by parties to enable that ability as we move forward, and that will help this whole process, immensely. But it seems like we already have so many of the tools in place to develop a forward-thinking tool, which is what this is supposed to be. And you're not supposed to just have to use interconnection study to be able to to accommodate that.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, don't disagree. I think we are working to make mode ICA more forward-looking. Like our interim solution is about using, how can, in the portal we showed, that's like, how do we use that other forward-looking data that we already have to help customers in the interim. So I think, I don't think it's necessarily, it's just, again, it's the scale of the undertaking and the ability to pull it off, I think, is maybe where the expectations are just not aligning with at least where PG&E is at right now.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to take this last question from Michelena Johnson, who would like to ask, regarding the installation of residential and public EV chargers, what are the main challenges to offering speedy energization timeframes? And this is directed mainly to the utilities, but they're also interested in input from charging companies.
This is E from SCG&E. I'm going to take a stab at responding to that. So right now for our load interconnection application, at least for SCG&E, we kind of treat all load application the same way because we are under the governing rule have to process them in the same fashion. I am aware there's different kind of timeline governed by different rule and tariff, not personally expert on that. But for this particular question, I don't think there's really, if I'm not reading incorrectly, I don't think for SCG&E there's a different kind of a process for the EV energization.
So would you say that the main challenge is that for EV charger interconnection, that it is in the same queue as all the rest of the interconnection?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to categorize it as a challenge, right? For my awareness, right, just talking with our team and looking at how we process load interconnection applications. So I'm not aware that we have any timeline or barrier with accommodating any interconnection process in any interconnection projects, including EV. So I don't really think SCG&E currently have an issue with accommodating the applications, including EV electrification. So hesitant to say that there's a challenge with us making it more timely. It's just that we treat them consistently across different type of load projects, and we're confident that we're handling them in a timely fashion. Does that answer your question?
This question was from Michelena Johnson, if they're able to follow up.
Oh, thanks. Is it on now?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I realize I'm not in charge of the remote or mute unmute function. Yeah, thank yeah, thanks. I'm with Cal Advocates. I'm on the distribution planning and policy team. We're currently doing an internal write-up on energization timeframes for electric vehicle chargers. And I was looking at a few resolutions. I don't remember the number at the moment, unfortunately, but just a few months ago, the commission passed a resolution asking for utilities to hasten or expedite the energization time frame from 160 days to 125 days for various applications, including EV chargers. And there were some challenges enumerated by the utilities in sort of the background section of these resolutions. And I was just wondering what challenges remain for making sure that applications for EV chargers are able to meet that 125-day time frame. Does that help? Do I need to clarify anything else in my question?
Yeah, that's helpful. We unfortunately don't have all the right SME to discuss all the steps in that timeline. I have other colleagues who are more closely involved in the EV proceeding. I would say, if I remember correctly, utilities have articulated some of the challenges with the timeline and the concern. Some of it have to be associated with a lot of steps in the international process outside of the utilities control. For example, permitting, right? That probably is one of the reasons that there was some concern with committing to a timeline that we don't all, have control over. But, if there's further details, you have any follow-up question, feel free to reach out. We can always connect you to the right colleague too, if you have any question or concerns.
Hey, E, can you hear me? This is Matt Belden with SCG&E.
Can hear you.
Yeah, great question. Just to clarify a bit more on that, right? I think there was a lot of questions that naturally come up around Rule 45, specifically for SDG&E. I think the 125-day clock, if you're asking specifically about that, right? That clock really starts after we have an application final submittal. So that really points towards we've received all of the detail from the customer, right? We understand all of their loads, we understand the full timing of their project, and that's kind of when that clock starts. I think a challenge with a lot of these load projects that we can have at times is, right, these projects are very large, there's a lot of equipment, and customers even at times are not certain the amount of load that will materialize at what stage, at what time, if it's going to be phased. So that is why it's so critical to partner and engage with our customers very early on in their process. So then we have a full plan to accommodate and provide service for their load. So, I know the 125-day clock is part of that rule, and I don't anticipate we'll have any issues meeting that.
Thank you for that response. We are running a little bit behind and we're almost out of time, so apologies for not being able to get to all of the questions, but that's the time we have for now, and I will turn it back to Taru.
Thank you, Tyler. So as promised, I think Sky from IRIC wants to make a comment. Sky, please go ahead.
Thank you, Taru. So I wanted to kind of sum what I understood from today's workshop and provide some stakeholder perspective. So I think that there's an elephant in the room that's been ignored that makes that almost all of the changes that the utilities, at least some of the utilities, have proposed, not worth pursuing at this point. SDG, DG&E, and SCE's results, they have told us multiple times, including in recent conversations in the last month, are not accurate at the moment based on just the current baseline of what the interconnection or what the grid state should be. All of the changes that we're proposing, I strongly support in terms of adding, load projects and adding other distribution system planning projects. All of those are really important changes, and I think they're responsive to the needs of the EV companies and other electrification needs. But doing those on top of models that are fundamentally wrong would be a huge unduly expensive mistake. And the commission has made that mistake multiple times at this point, and we really need to stop and make sure that we're starting from a reasonably accurate baseline. The utilities have told us multiple times today that accuracy is not really their priority. And I think that that's on the record. We've heard them say that. And so I think that when the developers are saying we need an accurate result and these additions are helpful, we need to make sure that what they're building on is accurate. And the idea that the current ICA still shows the vast majority of the nodes in 2 of the utilities' territories as having zero hosting capacity suggests, and the utilities have confirmed to me multiple times, that they do not believe that is accurate. But no one's identified what we're going to do to resolve that underlying problem before we move ahead with these important additions to the process. So that's part of my comment. And then I wanted to make a comment about the workshop overall and the engagement of stakeholders. I think the utilities had an opportunity to submit 2 reports, which the stakeholders have read. This workshop really didn't allow for parties to express different opinions about what the purpose of the ICA is, what the history of the ICA is, and why we're here. You allowed mostly questions and not a sufficient opportunity for other stakeholder perspectives. And I will say that I think a lot of the things that utilities said I agree with strongly, but I think there's also a lot of things they were saying as though they were speaking for the commission and not as the utility perspective. So I think the commission should consider having another workshop that digs into specifically the underlying accuracy issues before we proceed with doing these really significant and costly changes. And that workshop should be more collaborative and allow for more stakeholder conversation and input. Thank you.
So Sky, while this is a recorded workshop, these comments or whatever has been said is not on the record. So I do want to correct what you just said.
That's good to know.
And I mean, the agenda has been sent out. This is a chance for the IOUs to update us on their refinements, which they have done. We've had plenty of time to ask questions. So that is how we organize the workshop. And I'm sure it could be improved. So thank you for your comments.
Hi, Tara, this is Elia. I just want to kind of jump in and clarify that we have not made the assertion like Sky was indicating that our ICA is inaccurate. We have repeatedly stated that we are in the process of continuing to make our model more accurate. And even though we are in the process of making refinement as presented and as ordered, and in this workshop, we don't agree that it takes away from the uses of the ability to use ICA. So I disagree with that statement.
Yeah, and this is Bill
I'd
Peter
like
with
to
PG&E as well.
second that also.
Yeah. I think in fact PG&E I feel like we were trying to convey that we think ICA data is accurate. PG&E.
And I'd like to also, the comment made about the models not being accurate, in terms of the load interconnection use case, again, that was never actually fully developed historically as the Gen ICA use case was, right? So a lot of the conversations and, why we're here, right, is to talk about the refinements. And with the refinements, we're hoping to get, to where we are with the Rule 21 interconnection and that specific use case in terms of the models. And that's why we're now instantiating forecasts, plan system upgrades, transfers. All of that wasn't included in the past because the concentration for ICA was completely on the generation side, right? Now there is, we're moving forwards with the refinements. So I wouldn't characterize the models as being off, right, or being inaccurate.
So I think what I would like to do, and the reason I'm calling for another workshop, is that these are very high-level statements. We really need to dig into the methodology, and I know that people hate doing that, but if the utilities are saying that the accuracy is going to be improved, we need to get specific about what that means and looks like. I have looked at these very carefully and I'm deeply familiar with the methodology. And there is nothing that I've seen in the plans that would change the underlying state of SDG and Edison's results, which is why we need to figure out how. I think that there needs to at least be some simulations to show that things are going to change, or we need to agree that there's no hosting capacity on their systems if that's the case, but they have assured us that that's not the case. So we're clearly talking past each other, and that to me seems like an important reason for another workshop, so that parties really do understand what they're going to get out of the ICA if we're going to spend lots more ratepayer funds refining this.
So thank you to Sky and the IOUs. I think everyone's had a chance to make their comments. And Sky, your proposal for a second workshop, I think that's a question for ED, and we can discuss this offline. But for now, I would like to close out this workshop with a final slide of next steps. Thank you, Tyler. So thank you to all the presenters and the panelists, and for everyone who participated. We really appreciate it very much. So the next steps, and you'll see a lot of TBDs. A lot of these dates are not well defined at this time. There will be a staff proposal and a workshop on the staff proposal, which will cover the data portals. The stakeholders will have a comment period for this staff proposal, and there is a plan of a proposed decision, and that date is not firm yet, late 2023 or sometime in 2024. So with that, Gabe, do you have anything to add, or Tyler or Matt?
Yeah, thanks. And just wanted to add that I think there's one more step that will precede a staff proposal. And again, we don't have a firm date, but I think we can say that fairly soon there will be some questions. Sorry, it's late in the day. There will be a ruling with some questions for parties on a variety of issues in phase 1 of track 1 of the high DR proceeding. And so there will be some specific questions about ICA and data portal improvement. And those will help inform the staff proposal. So I know we don't have a firm date yet. We had a number of schedule changes recently that have pushed back several planned projects. And so we'll have more updates on that. But just to let you know that that would be our next step to further develop the record. So those comments would be on the record and they could inform a staff proposal. So I just wanted to add that, and then just invite, as Taru did, anyone else from the ED team to have any closing remarks.
I'll just jump in and say I appreciate everyone's participation in this workshop. Thank you.
Commissioner Howe, did you want to make a few closing remarks?
I just wanted to thank everyone for the discussion today. I really appreciate hearing from the parties, hearing the presentations and the comments. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Sorry.
We also have the opportunity to say thank you for sharing all your thoughts, and I'm hoping through further dialogue we could continue the partnership and the collaboration. So thank you very much for all of your feedback.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And it's 3:50, and this workshop comes to an end. Have a good evening.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.